This is Mr. Burr, and this is a recording of the first chapter of The Great Gatsby, broken down into three separate parts with short checks at the end of each part. So if you're watching this, you're probably in my junior A2C class. Hello. You can also read this on your own. There's a link to these files, so if you don't want me to read it with you, you can read it on your own, and that's cool too. So we're going to go ahead and get into it. The book starts with a quote. It is a fake quote from a non-real author. The quote is, "Then wear the gold hat if that will move her. If you can bounce high, bounce for her too, till she cry, lover, gold-hatted, high-bouncing lover, I must have you," by Thomas Park de Invilliers. Now that's not a real person. That's a fake person in a fiction novel. So we're already starting off kind of like in the reality that F. Scott Fitzgerald, the actual author of The Great Gatsby, is creating for us. I have, of course, Iron Man in here, and he is kind of our gold-headed lover who can bounce high. We're going to be talking a lot about wealth inequality in this book, and the haves and the have-nots. And it's important to think a little bit about that. It's very English teachery, but the hat is gold. We're trying to get the girl, and there's already this get the girlness and this emphasis on gildedness, even on the first page, even as we open this book. So here we go, chapter 1 of The Great Gatsby. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. This is our narrator speaking to us. His name is Nick Carraway. And he's talking about how his dad basically said, you're well off. And Nick is well off. He's effectively a lower wealthy person, and he's not as wealthy as some of the other people we're going to meet, but he's pretty. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually talkative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me, and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person, and so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician, because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. And here we have Batman giving you an example of a wild, unknown man with secret grief. Just kind of vibing there in the rain. So our narrator, Nick, is one of those people who you could just talk to, one of those people who people just kind of offload all of their issues to. And they basically people talk at him and tell him their life story all the time. And he kind of most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently, I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or even a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least in terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. So even Nick feels that there's an order among people, and that some people are boring to listen to talk, and some people are interesting to listen to talk to. And he says he has feigned sleep. That's our first ACT aligned word, meaning pretended. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. And this is our narrator, Nick, from the film, played here by Spider-Man. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous outings with lucky sights into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an honest contempt. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. So we get a little more insight into Nick's character here, and we get introduced to good old Gatsby, the character that gives the title to the book. We also have the word riotous, meaning intense or loud. Um, and we meet Gatsby, and it's strange that right here we have Nick describing Gatsby as a character for whom he has contempt. There are aspects of Gatsby that Nick is disgusted by the end of this book, and he's going to kind of walk us to that. Their responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability, which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament, meaning Gatsby wasn't like an artist. He had an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which it is not likely I shall ever find again. Now, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams, that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of man. Like straight up, if we could all just write like this, like what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams. Good Lord, what freaking genius level writing. So we find out that Nick thinks that Gatsby has an extraordinary gift for hope. He's a hopeful person. Gatsby's a romantic. He's an idealist. He believes in pure forms and ideals. So we kind of have Nick giving us more insight into the Gatsby's character here. Now Nick's going to tell us a little bit more about his family. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this middle western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch, but the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in '51, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to a rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in my father's office. So this line here, sent a substitute to the Civil War, is kind of some insight into Nick's degree of wealth. Nick's family is fairly wealthy. They're wealthy enough that he was able to pay for someone else to go to the Civil War for him during the draft. That's wealthy. And wealthy families at the time did do that, and they sent someone instead of going to fight, which is pretty crazy. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later I participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter raid so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like a ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. And here we learn a little bit more about Nick's history. He served in World War I. We're going to learn that Gatsby also fought in World War I. Effectively, all the men of a certain age fought in that war, except for the people who had enough money to avoid it. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, "Why, yes," with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays I came east, permanently, I thought, in the spring of '22. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season, and I just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees, so when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month, but at the last minute the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out to the country alone. Bungalows are a term, just kind of a specific type of house. I had a dog. At least, I had him for a few days, until he ran away, and an old Dodge, and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. It was lonely for a day or so, until one morning some man, more recently arrived than I, stopped me on the road. "How'd you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an originalist settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. Conferred just means gifted. Basically, Nick's like, yeah, I wasn't the newest person in my neighborhood. And so, with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. There was so much to read for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young breath-giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Maecenas knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books beside. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News, and now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at from a single window, after all. It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. So we're going to get some insight into the physical setting of the book here on the next slide. 20 miles from the city, meaning New York, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals, like the egg in the Columbus story. They are both crushed flat at the contact end, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless, a more arresting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. So, kind of the setting of our text. This is effectively the whole, or the majority of the book will take place here. So, this on the left is New York. So you have the island of New York, you have the island of Manhattan, where the city is. Then you have East Egg and West Egg. And the majority of our main characters are going to live on East Egg and West Egg. In between them, there's a long railroad ride into town, or road into town. And there's this area in the center that we're going to learn a lot about, where basically all of the, I'm circling it in green right now. So like this green circled area is basically where all of the servants for the wealthy people in the eggs and in Manhattan live. So they basically drive through this area where these poor folks live who work in town every time they go to New York, and that's going to become really important as we go through the text. That's kind of our setup. I lived at West Egg, the less fashionable of the two, though this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound, the water, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for 12 or 15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked, so I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. That is such a tiny amount of money to live anywhere in New York, and I know that it's historically a different amount of money today, but like, I just can't imagine spending $80 a month to live anywhere. Across the Courtesy Bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water. And the history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college, and just after the war I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful Inns that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure in a way, one of those men who reach such an acute limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. That is like legit. That is like one of the most like intense burns in the text. Nick is not a huge fan of Tom, and that's going to come through in the way that he describes Tom. Though he does think that Tom is pretty swole, Tom's pretty built. He will describe Tom's physical body a lot, but he's one of those men who reach such an acute limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors an anticlimax. Basically, Nick's telling us that Tom is one of those guys who peaked in high school, and like for the rest of his life, he's trying to like reclaim the glory of his high school football days. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. But now he'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he'd brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. When they came east, why they came east, I don't know. They had spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then drifted here and there unrestfully wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on forever, seeking a little wistfully for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. There's that dig again. Against. And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach. They ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walls and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines as though from the momentum of its run, the front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold, and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon, and Tom Buchanan, in riding clothes, was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. It's kind of a visual of what that house may look like. All right, so this is a recap and review. This is ungraded. If you can't answer these questions on the left, you probably want to take notes differently than however you're taking notes, or maybe consider not listening to me to complete this assignment, to complete the readings, but reading it on your own, or doing this reading in some other way. So who told the narrator whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. That will be the narrator's father. Who is the narrator? It is Nick Carraway. Where does the narrator live? He lives in West Egg, which is the less fashionable of the two eggs. Again, they're not literal eggs, it's just like the shape of the land. Who does the narrator describe as having an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which it is not likely I shall ever find again? That is our man Gatsby. Which war did he fight in? That's World War One. Who is the narrator about to eat dinner with? The Tom Buchanans, which is the way that sometimes people described married people back in the day. They would literally describe them both as the Tom Buchanans instead of just the Buchanans because of the way that marriage worked. Women were effectively the property of their husbands, which is pretty intensely crazy. And what is the narrator's money situation? He is fairly wealthy, and you can kind of hear that in when his father says, everybody hasn't had the same advantage as you. And that is the end of the first third of this reading. I'm going to continue on to the next. Here are your ACT aligned terms if you're interested in creating an ACT journal for building your vocabulary. All right, there you go with chapter 1, part. We're speaking about Tom Buchanan here. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing and you could see a great pack of muscles shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage. A cruel body. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of argumentativeness he conveyed. There was a touch of fatherly contempt in it, even toward people he liked, and there were men at New Haven who had hated his guts. Tom is a classic example of what Fitzgerald is going to come to present you as old money. Tom is very much a person who inherited his wealth and has kind of had a silver spoon for his entire life. Now, don't think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I had always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. I've got a nice place here, he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide off the shore. It belonged to Domain, the oil man. He turned me around again, politely and abruptly. We'll go inside. We walked through a high hallway into a bright rosy-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew curtains in at one end and out at the other like pale flags, twisting them up toward the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it, as wind does. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch, on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they'd just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I, I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear windows, and the wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rugs, and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless, and with her chin raised a little as if she were balancing something on it, which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eyes, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed, an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too and came forward into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness. She laughed again as if she said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising that there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean toward her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered, she nodded at me almost imperceptibly, and then quickly tipped her head back again. The object she was balancing had obviously tottered a little and given her something of a fright. Again a sort of apology arose to my lips. Almost any exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws a stunned tribute from me. I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright passionate mouth, but there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget. A singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, and that there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. I told her how I'd stopped off in Chicago for a day, on my way east, and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. Do they miss me? She cried ecstatically. The whole town is desolate. All the cars have the left rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night long along the North Shore. He's being sarcastic. There probably isn't all that going on in Chicago. They're just kind of making small talk. How gorgeous! Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow. Then she added irrelevantly, You ought to see the baby. I'd like to. She's asleep. She's 2 years old. Haven't you ever seen her? Never. Well, you ought to see her. She's. Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested his hand on my shoulder. What are you doing these days, Nick? I'm a bond man. Who with? I told him. Never heard of them, he remarked decisively. This annoyed me. You will, I answered shortly. You will if you stay in the East. Oh, I'll stay in the East, don't you worry, he said, glancing at Daisy and then at me, as if he were alert for something more. I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else. At this point, Miss Baker said, Absolutely, with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she uttered since I came into the room. Evidently, it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned, and with a series of rapid, deft movements, stood up into the room. I'm stiff, she complained. I've been lying on that sofa for as long as I can remember. Don't look at me, Daisy retorted. I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon. No, thanks, said Miss Baker to the 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. I'm absolutely in training. Her host looked at her incredulously. You are? He took down his drink as if it were a drop in the bottom of a glass. How you ever get anything done is beyond me. She's a cat. That's incredulous, because the word incredulous is a great word. It means like suspicious. I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. I enjoyed looking at her. She was a slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backward at the shoulders like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. It occurred to me now that I had seen her, or a picture of her somewhere before. You live in West Egg? She remarked contemptuously. I know somebody there. I don't know a single. You must know Gatsby. All right, so first off, a couple things going on here. One, she assumes that he knows Gatsby because he lives in West Egg. Because Gatsby's like the guy to know in West Egg. Two, contemptuously. She looks down on people in West Egg. That's the new money people. That's the people who are like making money in the stock market, like Nick would like to make money in bonds. That's people who weren't born into their wealth. So for Jordan Baker, West Egg is kind of a disgusting place to her. It's the new money folks. Gatsby? Demanded Daisy. What Gatsby? Before I could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the 2 young women preceded us out onto a rosy-colored porch open toward the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminishing wind. Why candles? Objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. In 2 weeks it'll be the longest. She looked at all of us radiantly. Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it? I always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it. We ought to plan something, yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. All right, said Daisy. What do we plan? She turned to me helplessly. What do people plan? Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. Look, she complained. I heard it. We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. All right, I know that this is a boring thing going on. There's just a bunch of like rich white people talking about like boring, like what might we do today? But there's a lot going on here, like in their dialogue. They're very, I mean, it's very much small talk. Um, You did it, Tom, she said accusingly. I know you didn't mean to, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man, a great big hulking physical specimen of a. I hate that word. Hulking, objected Tom crossly. Even in kidding. Hulking, insisted Daisy. Oh man, there's so much like you can hear their entire relationship, right? In that moment. Hulking. Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, unobtrusively, and with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter. That was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes and the absence of all desire. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. And that's just hulking, right? They knew that presently dinner would be over, and a little later the evening too would be over, and casually put away. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase toward its close in a continually disappointed anticipation or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. "You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy," I confessed on my second glass of corky but rather impresent claret. "Can't you talk about crops or something?" I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in an unexpected way. "Civilization's going to pieces," broke out Tom violently. "I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard?" "Why, no," I answered, rather surprised by his tone. All right, so on top of being old money and a truly terrible husband, Tom is also a racist. And he's not even in effect, like, he's not even a well-read racist. He calls it Goddard, but this is the book that he's quoting here. And he is quoting a white supremacist. Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved. "Tom's getting very profound," said Daisy, with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. "He reads deep books with long words in them. What was that word we—" "Well, these books are all scientific," insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. "This fellow has worked out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out, or these other races will have control of things." So you can hear some of the dynamic between Daisy and Tom's relationship too. Plays with him. Okay, so that's the second section, and we're at 30 minutes. So each of these is about 15 minutes long. Again, if you can't answer the events questions, you probably should be taking notes or taking better notes. So what kind of language does Nick use to describe Tom's body type? Really specific language. He calls him cruel. He says cruel body capable of cruelty. Who does Jordan Baker assume Nick must know? Because he lives in West Egg, and that's Gatsby. What kind of book does Tom Buchanan tell Nick he should be reading? It is a racist book, a white supremacist book. And name the three characters we have met so far. So far we've met Nick Carraway, Daisy Buchanan, and Tom Buchanan, and Jordan Baker. So we've met four characters so far. I don't know that we've heard Nick Carraway's full name yet. And here are your vocabulary terms. They're pronounced supercilious, conscientious, surname, ecstatically, desolate, incredulous, and hulking. All right, and this is our last section in chapter 1, each of these sections being about 15 minutes long. "We've got to beat them down," whispered Daisy, winking ferociously toward the fervent sun. "You ought to live in California," began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. "This idea is that we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and—" After an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy, with a slight nod, and she winked at me again. "And we've produced all the things that go to make civilization, science and art and all that. Do you see?" There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough to him anymore. So what that means is, what Nick's saying is that, Tom's racism is kind of pathetic to Nick, in that, he couldn't simply be quietly racist any longer, but he had to become actively racist, and his complacency wasn't enough for him anymore, that he probably grew up with at New Haven, which is this extremely wealthy prep school that he and Nick both went to. When almost immediately the telephone rang inside and the butler left the porch, Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned toward me. "I'll tell you a family secret," she whispered enthusiastically. "It's about the butler's nose. Do you want to hear about the butler's nose? And Nick kind of jokingly lies. He says, That's why I came over tonight. Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be the silver polisher for some people in New York that had a silver service for 200 people. He had to polish it from morning till night until finally it began to affect his nose. Things went from bad to worse, suggested Miss. Yes, things went from bad to worse until finally he had to give up his position. For a moment, the last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face. Her voice compelled me forward breathlessly as I listened. Then the glow faded, each light deserting her with lingering regret, like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk. That's gold just because that's some really beautiful writing. The butler came back and murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushing back his chair, and without a word went inside. As if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward again, her voice glowing and singing. I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose. Doesn't he? She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. An absolute rose? This was untrue. I am not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her as if her heart was trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly she threw her napkin on the table and excused herself and went into the house. Miss Baker and I exchanged a short glance, consciously devoid of meaning. I was about to speak when she sat up alertly and said, Shh, in a warning voice. A subdued, impassioned murmur was audible in the room beyond, and Miss Baker and I leaned forward, unashamed, trying to hear. The murmur trembled on the verge of coherence, sank down, mounted excitedly, and then ceased altogether. So they're kind of listening to this argument that Daisy and Tom are having in the other room after Tom received a phone call. And Daisy famously compares Nick Carraway to a rose, an absolute rose. This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of is my neighbor? I said. Don't talk. I want to hear what happens. Is something happening? I inquired innocently. You mean to say you don't know? Said Miss Baker, honestly surprised. I thought everybody knew. I don't. Why, she said hesitantly, Tom's got some woman in New York. So this is Tom's side chick, Myrtle, who is calling during dinner. That would be pretty important. Got some woman? I repeated blankly. Miss Baker nodded. She might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think? Almost before I had grasped her meaning, there was the flutter of a dress, the crunch of leather boots, and Tom and Daisy were back at the table. It couldn't be helped, cried Daisy with tense gaze. She sat down, glanced searchingly at Miss Baker and then at me, and continued. I looked outdoors for a minute, and it's very romantic outdoors. There's a bird on the lawn that I think must be a nightingale come over on the Cunard or White Star Line. He's singing away. Her voice sang. It's romantic, isn't it, Tom? So she just straight up went in there and confronted her husband who was on the phone with his side chick. So there's a lot of tension going on here in this scene. Daisy's trying really hard to keep appearances of chillness going on, but very romantic, he said, and then miserably to me, if it's light enough after dinner, I want to take you down to the stables. The telephone rang inside startlingly, and as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, the subject of the stables, in fact all subjects, vanished into air. Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at table, I remember the candles being lit again, pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone and yet to avoid all eyes. My dude Nick Carraway is a huge third wheel throughout the entirety of this book. So he feels super awkward, so deeply awkward in this moment. He's like, I don't know who to say anything to. There's an affair going on, and everyone knows it, but we all have to pretend like there's nothing happening. I couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism, was able utterly to put this fifth guest's shrill metallic urgency out of mind. That fifth guest being the side chick who keeps calling on the phone. To a certain temperament, the situation might have seemed intriguing, but my own instinct was to telephone immediately for the police. The horses, needless to say, were not mentioned again. Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library, as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body. While trying to look pleasantly interested and a little deaf, I followed Daisy around a chain of connecting verandas to the porch in front. In its deep gloom, we sat down side by side on a wicker settee. We kind of end up alone together. Daisy took her face in her hands, as if feeling its lovely shape, and her eyes moved gradually out into the velvet dusk. I saw that turbulent emotions possessed her, so I asked what I thought would be some sedative questions about her little girl. "We don't know each other very well, Nick," she said suddenly, "even if we are cousins. You didn't come to my wedding." "I wasn't back from the war." "That's true." She hesitated. "Well, I've had a very bad time, Nick, and I'm pretty." Evidently she had reason to be. I waited, but she didn't say any more, and after a moment I returned rather feebly to the subject of her daughter. "I suppose she talks and eats and everything?" "Oh, yes." She looked at me absently. "Listen, Nick, let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear?" "Very much." "It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where. I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling and asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or a girl. She told me it was a girl, and so I turned my head away and wept. 'All right,' I said, 'I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool.' You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow," she went on in a convinced way. "Everybody thinks so, the most advanced people, and I know. I've been around everywhere and seen everything and done everything." Her eyes flashed around her in a defiant way, rather like Tom's, and she laughed with thrilling scorn. "Sophisticated? God, I'm sophisticated." Okay, so we could pause here for a second while Daisy is all in her feelings. But what she says about her daughter there is super important on a lot of levels. She finds out that she's having a girl and she says, "I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool." You gotta understand what marriage was in this time period. Daisy is very much tied to Tom. This man who takes calls from a side chick at dinner and has no apology about it to her or the people that she's with. So she's very much tethered to this guy who's kind of a terrible person. Really is a terrible person. And she's tethered to him by marriage and by this baby. So she hopes that her daughter will be a fool and won't be able to see how rough things are, how terribly hard it is to be a woman in this time period. The instant her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she said. It made me uneasy, as though the whole evening had been a trick of some sort to exact a contributory emotion from me. I waited, and sure enough, in a moment she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she'd asserted her membership in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged. Inside, the crimson room bloomed with light. Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch, and she read aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post, the words, murmurous and uninflected, running together in a soothing. The lamplight, bright on his boots and dull on the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as she turned a page with a flutter of slender muscles in her arms. When we came in, she held us silent for a moment with a lifted hand. "To be continued," she said, tossing the magazine on the table, "in our very next issue." Her body asserted itself with a restless movement of her knee, and she stood up. "10 o'clock," she remarked, apparently finding the time on the ceiling. "Time for this good girl to go to bed." "Jordan's going to play in the tournament tomorrow," explained Daisy, "over at Westchester." "Oh, you're Jordan Baker." I knew now why her face was familiar. Its pleasing, contemptuous expression had looked out at me from many rotograph pictures of the sporting life at Asheville and Hot Springs and Palm Beach. I'd heard some story of her too, a critical, unpleasant story, but what it was I'd forgotten long ago. "Good night," she said softly. "Wake me at 8, won't you?" "If you'll get up." "I will. Good night, Mr. Carraway. See you anon." "Of course you will," confirmed Daisy. "In fact, I think I'll arrange a marriage. Come over often, Nick, and I'll fling you together, lock you up accidentally in linen closets and push you out to sea in a boat and all that sort of thing." "Good night," called Miss Baker from the stairs. "I haven't heard a word." She's a nice girl, said Tom after a moment. They oughtn't let her run around the country this way. Who oughtn't to? Inquired Daisy coldly. Her family. Again, the tension between Tom and Daisy, the way that they think about people, the way that they think about Jordan Baker's movements. Tom disapproves of Jordan Baker, who's old money, running around and kind of like staying with people, and Daisy is pro Jordan, kind of getting to do what she wants. Her family is one aunt, about 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick's going to look after her, aren't you, Nick? She's going to spend lots of weekends out here this summer. I think the home influence will be very good for her. Daisy and Tom looked at each other for a moment in silence. Is she from New York? I asked quickly. From Louisville. Our white girlhood was passed together there. Our beautiful white... Did you give Nick a little heart-to-heart talk on the veranda? Demanded Tom suddenly. Did I? She looked at me. I can't seem to remember, but I think we talked about the Nordic race. Yes, I'm sure we did. It sort of crept up on us. First thing you know, and she's just like screwing with Tom here and making fun of him. Don't believe everything you hear, Nick, he advised me. I said lightly that I had heard nothing at all, and a few minutes later I got up to go home. They came to the door with me and stood side by side in a cheerful square of light. As I started my motor, Daisy peremptorily called, Wait! I forgot to ask you something, and it's important. We heard you were engaged to a girl out west. That's right, corroborated Tom kindly. We heard that you were engaged. It's libel. I'm too poor. That was just like written. But we heard it, insisted Daisy, surprising me by opening up again in a flower-like way. We heard it from 3 people, so it must be true. Of course, I knew what they were referring to, but I wasn't even vaguely engaged. The fact that gossip had published the banns was one of the reasons I'd come east. You can't stop going with an old friend on account of rumors. But on the other hand, I had no intention of being rumored into a marriage. Their interest rather touched me and made them less remotely rich. Nevertheless, I was a little confused and disgusted as I drove away. It seemed to me that the thing for Daisy to do was rush out of the house, child in arms. But apparently there were no such intentions in her head. So like Nick thinks that Daisy should get out of that marriage because it's obviously pretty crappy. Okay, quick recap. So again, advanced questions, if you can't answer these on the left, you should maybe try to take different kinds of notes, or maybe don't read along with me audio-wise, or slow down this video on YouTube, which is an option also. So Tom Buchanan isn't simply bored. How does Nick Carraway describe his complacency? It's like active complacency. He's become actively racist. What flower does Nick remind Daisy of? A rose, an absolute rose. How comfortable is Nick during the dinner? Not. He's not comfortable. He's super awkward. What does Tom have in New York that makes dinner so awkward? Really, that should say who does Tom have in New York, and that's a side chick. How did Daisy react to having a baby girl? She said, I hope she's a beautiful fool, because Daisy's experience of being a woman in this time period has been really crappy for her. What does Daisy offer to do for Nick and Jordan Baker? Throw them together and like hook them up. What does Nick think Daisy should do, but probably won't? And that's leave. And our terms for chapter 1, all of them together, are right here. And that is the end of chapter 1 of The Great Gatsby. I hope this was valuable for you. If you listen to it, I'm going to do this for all of the chapters that we read as a class or reference in our journals or questions. Thanks for listening. Bye.